The year is 216 BC. You are a Roman citizen going about your day, and then someone starts running. One person, then another. Then an entire street erupts into panic. A rumor tears through the city like fire through dry wheat, passed from mouth to mouth, neighbor to neighbor, mother to child. 5 words that would haunt Rome for generations. Hannibal is at the gates. Everything stops. The merchant across from you goes pale. An old soldier sitting in the corner of the tavern, a man who has seen battle, a man who does not scare easily, he stands up and walks out without a word. Because every Roman knows what those 5 words mean. Not a raid on the border, not a skirmish somewhere distant. This is the man who just killed Roman soldiers by the tens of thousands in a single afternoon. Ancient sources say as many as 70,000, in what even the most conservative modern estimates call one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. Let that number settle for a moment. Among the dead, 80 men of senatorial rank, 29 of Rome's 48 military tribunes, one of the 2 sitting consuls, an entire generation of Rome's finest, slaughtered in a field in southern Italy, while Hannibal's plan closed around them. In the days that followed, refugees poured into Rome with stories so horrifying that wealthy families began moving their valuables out of the city. The poor wondered openly if the gods had abandoned them. Some senators proposed abandoning Rome entirely, and Hannibal was still out there. For generations after that day, Roman mothers had a phrase for the worst thing they could imagine. When a child misbehaved, when a crisis hit, when Rome itself trembled. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. It became the Roman way of saying, this is as bad as it gets. Military academies around the world still teach his tactics today, 2,200 years later. Napoleon ranked him among history's great commanders. That is not a small thing to say about a man who never won his war. So, who was this man? How does a general from a city in North Africa march an army across the Alps as winter was closing in, arrive in Italy with half his men dead, and then proceed to dismantle the most resilient military machine the Mediterranean had ever seen? Battle after battle, year after year, for 15 straight years. Here is the part of this story that most people never hear. He was undefeated for 15 years. No Roman general could stop him. No Roman army could break him, but he didn't win. And the people who destroyed him were not the Romans. They were his own. This is the story of Hannibal Barca, not just the story of a military genius, not just the story of a man who crossed the Alps with elephants and made Rome bleed. This is the story of what happens when one of the greatest generals in history fights completely alone. And the question that has haunted historians for 2,000 years, what if he hadn't been? Before there was Hannibal, there was Carthage. And before Hannibal could hate Rome, Rome had to give him a reason. In 264 BC, Carthage was not a city that feared anything. Carthage was the dominant naval and commercial power in the western Mediterranean. At its height, it could put hundreds of warships to sea, with the best sailors in the ancient world. Its trading routes stretched from Spain to Egypt. When Carthage wanted something, it sent ships. When something stood in its way, it sent more ships. Rome was still a land power, a republic of farmers and soldiers who had never built an ocean-going war fleet. And then Sicily happened. Sicily was the richest island in the Mediterranean. Grain, timber, harbors. Both powers wanted it, and in 264 BC, they went to war over it. The First Punic War. 23 years. Here is what made Rome different from every enemy Carthage had ever faced. Rome lost fleets, 4, possibly 5, to storms and battle. By ancient historians' accounts, they copied a wrecked Carthaginian warship design and built a major fleet from scratch. Then they lost it. Then they built another. They lost tens of thousands of men at sea, more than they lost in most land campaigns. And they came back. Every time. That is not how most powers operated in the ancient world. Carthage understood profit and loss. When a war became too expensive, you negotiated. Rome was willing to pay costs that Carthage's political class often judged irrational. Because Rome had reserves, Carthage didn't. Its alliance system with Italian cities fed its soldiers in numbers that no single city-state could match. It could absorb losses that would have ended any other civilization. Carthage had a general in Sicily named Hannibal Barca. He did not lose battles. He held the Romans in the mountains for years, outmaneuvered them, denied them the decisive engagement they needed. Hannibal had not been beaten. And then, in 241 BC, Rome built one more fleet. They caught Carthaginian supply ships off the Aegates Islands. Dozens were sunk, more were captured. Hamilcar's army, still undefeated on land, was cut off. The men who ran Carthage were merchants. They looked at the cost of another fleet, the cost of another year, and they decided, enough. They signed a peace. They surrendered Sicily. They agreed to pay 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years. Hannibal was not consulted. He was not defeated. His army was still in the field. He sailed back to Africa under terms he had not agreed to for a defeat he had not suffered. What followed was the worst 3 years of his life. The soldiers Carthage had sent to Sicily, and couldn't pay, came home angry. When the government stalled on their wages, they rebelled. Tens of thousands of them. The mercenary war, they called it. It nearly destroyed the city from within. And Carthage sent Hamilcar to stop it. He spent 3 years fighting what ancient historians called the Truceless War, a conflict so savage, so stripped of any rules or mercy, that it stood apart even by the standards of the ancient world. Men who had once fought beside Carthage's army in Sicily, some perhaps under his own command, were now his prey. He killed them because no one else could. He did what was asked of him, and while he was doing it, Rome watched and waited. In 238 BC, with Carthage still fighting for its survival against its own mercenaries, Rome sent an ultimatum: hand over Sardinia, hand over Corsica, pay another 1,200 talents. On top of the war debt you already owe. Carthage was in no position to refuse. Rome had waited for the moment of maximum weakness and seized 2 more islands without firing a single shot. That was not a negotiation. That was not war. That was a message. We will take what we want when we want it, and there is nothing you can do. Hannibal had now seen everything he needed to see. He had watched the merchants surrender Sicily without asking him. He had killed his own veterans to clean up their mess, and he had watched Rome, the enemy he had fought to a standstill for years, simply reach out and take more, in peacetime, without consequence. He understood now. Rome would not stop, not ever, not until there was nothing left of Carthage to take. In 237 BC, 4 years after the war ended, he sailed for Spain to rebuild Carthage's finances. His 9-year-old son followed him to the harbor and asked to come. Hannibal took the boy to an altar. What happened at that altar is the reason we are still talking about this family, 2,200 years later. 237 BC, Hannibal Barca is standing at the harbor. Behind him, Carthage, still paying Rome in silver, still pretending that what happened in Sicily was a negotiated settlement and not a surrender, still recovering from a mercenary rebellion it had barely survived. 3 brutal years that Hannibal himself had spent suppressing. Ahead of him, Spain, and the silver mines of Iberia that would rebuild what the merchants had given away. His son is 9 years old. The boy has followed him to the harbor like a shadow. He does what boys do when their father is about to leave for somewhere dangerous and far away. He asks to come. Hannibal looks at him for a long moment. He does not say no. He says, "If you want to come, you have to swear something first." He takes the boy to the altar of the gods, the place where an oath was not a promise between men, but a contract with heaven itself. The kind of oath that, if broken, brought ruin not just on the man who broke it, but on everyone he loved. He looked at his 9-year-old son and said, "Swear that you will never be a friend to Rome." The boy placed his hands on the altar and swore. He would keep that oath for more than half a century, not as a private family grudge, as a political conviction, the belief that Rome would not stop until Carthage was destroyed and that someone had to be willing to fight it to the end. Hamilcar had seen what Rome was. He was making sure his son saw it too. In Spain, Hamilcar built what Carthage refused to build at home, an army loyal to its general. He recruited Iberian and Celtiberian warriors, paid them from the silver mines, trained them himself. Hannibal grew up in those camps. He ate what the men ate. He trained beside veterans who had fought at Panormus and Drepana, men who had held Sicily for years while the merchants in Carthage counted coins. He learned the names of every officer, every unit, every tribe under the Barca standard. He was learning something that would define everything that followed. Soldiers fight for the man in front of them, not the city behind them. In 229 BC, Hamilcar died. Not killed by Romans. Killed in Spain, fighting a local tribe near a flooded river. The accounts differ. Some say he drowned crossing a river during a retreat. Others say he was killed in the fighting itself. Exactly how it happened, whether by chance or by choice, no one knows. What is known, he died on a battlefield that belonged to Carthage, surrounded by men who were loyal to him. Hannibal was 18. He did not take command. He was not yet ready, and everyone knew it. His brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, took over. For 8 years, Hasdrubal ruled Iberia through diplomacy, marrying into local tribes, founding the city of Carthago Nova, negotiating the Ebro Treaty with Rome that drew the boundary between their spheres of influence, a treaty Rome would respect only until it no longer suited them. He was a builder, not a warrior. Hannibal served under him as cavalry commander. He watched, learned, waited. In 221 BC, Hasdrubal was assassinated by a Celtic servant, a private grievance, nothing to do with Rome or Carthage. The army gathered. They did not wait for orders from Carthage. They did not hold a Senate vote. They looked at the 26-year-old cavalry commander who had grown up in their camps, who had eaten what they ate, who had never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. And they chose him. Carthage, as usual, approved after the fact. Hannibal now had what his father had spent a lifetime building: an army, a base, silver, and 3 years before Rome would find a reason to stop him. 8 years since his father had drowned in that river. He was finally ready. He only knew the oath. And the oath said, Rome. 221 BC. Hannibal is 26 years old and in command of an army that chose him. He leads the way his father led, at the front, eating what the men eat, sleeping in camp. His officers know his face. His soldiers know his name. In his first 2 years, he consolidates Spain through force and marriage, crushing those who resist, taking hostages from those who submit, binding the tribes to him personally, not to Carthage. In 219 BC, he turns to Saguntum. Saguntum lay south of the Ebro. Inside the zone Carthage believed the treaty left to them. Rome claimed the city was under its protection, a legal argument Carthage did not accept, a disputed loophole, a dagger in his backyard. He lays siege. 8 months. Saguntum's defenders fight with the desperation of people who know no rescue is coming. Rome sends envoys demanding he withdraw. He ignores them. Saguntum falls in late 219 BC. Hannibal is wounded, a javelin through the thigh. He stays in command. 218 BC. A Roman delegation arrives in Carthage. The envoy, Quintus Fabius, stood before the Senate and gathered a fold of his toga in his fist. I hold here both peace and war. Tell me which you will have. The Carthaginians told him to choose for himself. Fabius opened his hand. Let the toga fall. Then I leave you war. Carthage's Senate had just bound itself to Hannibal's war, though it would spend the next 16 years trying to wriggle free of him. He had started with 90,000 men. Before the Alps, he left 11,000 to garrison the Pyrenees and sent another 11,000 home. too homesick to be trusted in the mountains ahead. He crossed into Gaul with 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. There was one obstacle left: the Alps. Most of them would not make it through. The Alps in October are not the Alps of summer paintings. They are rock and ice and wind so cold it stops the blood. The passes narrow to ledges a man can barely walk, single file, with a 1,000-foot drop on one side and a frozen wall on the other. Horses lose their footing. Mules fall without sound. The baggage, grain, weapons, the entire supply chain of the army, slides off cliffs into nothing. They had 37 war elephants. These animals had never seen snow. Getting to the Alps had already cost him. The march through Gaul took weeks, skirmishes with local tribes, deserters slipping away in the night. Then the Rhone, 3 days of rafts, panicking horses, and war elephants floated across on timber platforms while they screamed. By the time the army reached the foot of the mountains, it was smaller than what had left Spain. The crossing itself took 15 days. Near the foot of the range, a Gallic tribe called the Allobroges offered guides. They pointed the way through the passes. Then, when the army was strung out across a high defile, thousands of men below, thousands above, the column stretched for miles. They rolled rocks down from the heights. The sound alone broke the horses. Hannibal had moved his cavalry and heavy infantry to the front the night before. What he couldn't prevent was the chaos. Boulders tearing through packed columns, men shoved off paths by panicking animals, the screaming of horses echoing off everything. He lost men. He kept moving. Higher up, a larger tribe blocked the path entirely. This time he made camp at dusk, waited for nightfall, and then seized the high ground above them in darkness. In the morning, the tribe found his infantry looking down at them from the ridge. They let the army pass. Near the summit, the path disappeared. A section of the cliff face had broken away, a sheer drop where the trail should have been. No way around it, no way over it. The army halted. He built a camp and tried fire. He piled wood against the rock face and heated it until the stone was scorching. Then, according to Livy, his men poured vinegar over it, the heat and acid together cracking what pickaxes alone could not. Whether vinegar actually fractures limestone at that scale, engineers have argued for centuries. What is not disputed: the rock gave way. His men worked through the night. By morning, they had a path. At the summit, he halted the entire army. He turned them south and pointed. The ridgelines blocked any view of the valley below. But he described what lay beyond them: warmth, grain fields, rivers, cities, allies waiting to join them. He told them that everything they had crossed a mountain range to reach was down there, and all they had to do now was walk downhill. Then they descended. The descent was, in some ways, worse. The slopes going down into Italy were steeper. Fresh snow had fallen, covering older ice underneath. Men slipped on surfaces they couldn't see. The elephants had to be led down one step at a time, terrified and frost-damaged. When they reached the Po Valley, Hannibal counted what he had left. He had crossed into Gaul with 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. The march through Gaul and the Rhone crossing had already taken thousands. By the time his army entered the Alps, he had roughly 38,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, around 46,000 total. He arrived in Italy with approximately 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The Alps alone had cost him nearly half of what entered them. Gone, dead on the paths, frozen in camp, fallen into gorges no one could search. He had no siege equipment. He was thousands of miles from Carthage, deep in enemy territory, with half the force he'd started with. And then something extraordinary happened. Gallic tribes from the Po Valley, men who had lived under Roman domination for decades, began arriving in his camp. Not to attack, to join. They had been waiting for exactly this. His first encounter with a Roman army in Italy was the Battle of Ticinus, a cavalry skirmish, not a pitched battle. But the Roman consul, Publius Scipio, was wounded in the fighting and nearly captured. He was saved when his teenage son rode into the melee to reach him. The boy's name was also Publius Scipio. He was 18 years old. In 16 years, he would be the man who finally beat Hannibal. Then came the Trebia. The consul Sempronius Longus had 40,000 men. He was furious, impatient, certain of victory. He crossed the Trebia River on a December morning, his men already half frozen, hungry, no breakfast. Straight into an ambush Hannibal had been preparing for days. Hidden cavalry, a strike force concealed in the reeds. Roman losses were catastrophic. Ancient accounts put casualties and prisoners in the tens of thousands. The elephants that had survived the Alps fought in that battle, and most of them died in the snowstorm that followed. Of the 37 that had crossed the mountains, ancient tradition remembers only one as surviving the winter. Hannibal had won his first full-scale victory in Italy with an army that had barely survived getting there, and it was not yet spring. He came south in the spring. The Trebia had been an ambush, a good one, but still. He had caught a Roman general who was overconfident and underfed. The Romans would call it bad luck, bad generalship. They would fix it. They would send someone better. He needed them to understand that it wasn't bad luck. 217 BC. The consul Gaius Flaminius was furious. He had watched Hannibal spend the winter in the Po Valley, raiding and recruiting, turning Roman allies into Carthaginian ones. He had watched Hannibal march south through Etruria, burning farms within sight of the road, and Rome could not stop him. The Senate was cautious. His fellow consul, Servilius, was still far to the north. The legions under his own command were the only ones in position to act. Flaminius decided he would act. He followed Hannibal south. When Hannibal's army disappeared around the edge of Lake Trasimene in the April morning fog, Flaminius marched his army along the lakeshore in pursuit. 30,000 Roman soldiers, strung out in a thin line between the hills on one side and the water on the other. Hannibal had been waiting there since before dawn. His army was hidden in the hills above, stretched for miles, every gap in the terrain covered. And then the fog closed in, a thick April fog off the lake that reduced visibility to a few feet. The Roman column couldn't see its own vanguard, couldn't see its own rear. The signal went up. They hit every section of the column at the same moment. The Romans had no room to form up, hills on one side, water on the other, the fog making everything invisible, enemies coming from above. Those at the front fought. Those at the center couldn't reach the fighting. Those at the rear couldn't even tell where it was coming from. It lasted about 3 hours. 15,000 Romans died. Most of them never saw who killed them. The consul Flaminius was cut down in the fighting. One of Hannibal's Gallic cavalrymen recognized him in the chaos and rode him down personally. 6,000 more were captured. Lake Trasimene was, and remains, one of the largest ambushes in recorded history. After Trasimene, the road to Rome was open. Hannibal did not take it. He turned east instead, toward the Adriatic coast, raiding and provisioning, giving Rome's Italian allies a choice: stay with Rome or join him. Many stayed, some joined. He kept moving. In Rome, the panic was worse than anything since the Gauls had sacked the city 200 years earlier. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, Rome's most senior statesman. Fabius understood what no Roman commander before him had grasped. Hannibal could not be beaten in the field. Not by them, not yet. So he didn't try. He shadowed Hannibal through the Italian countryside, camped on high ground, refused battle, cut off foragers, war at the edges without ever committing to the center. Rome called him cunctator, the delayer. They meant it as an insult. His strategy was working, but Rome ran out of patience. In 216 BC, they elected 2 new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, experienced and careful, and Gaius Terentius Varro, elected by popular vote, promising a quick end to this humiliation. They built the largest army Rome had ever fielded, somewhere between 70,000 and 86,000 men. 8 legions plus allies, nearly twice Hannibal's force. They were going to end this. August 2nd, 216 BC. The plain near Cannae. Hannibal had about 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Romans had nearly double his infantry. He set up his line with his weakest troops in the center, Gallic and Spanish infantry, less disciplined, less experienced, bowed out toward the Roman line. His best African veterans on the flanks, steady and patient. His cavalry on the wings. The Romans did what Roman armies always did. They packed their infantry tight, massed in depth, and pushed forward. More weight, more men, more force. The Roman way of winning. The Gauls and Spanish in Hannibal's center began to give way. The Romans pushed harder. The center bent backward, bowed in now, the Gauls retreating under the pressure, but slowly, in order, not breaking. The Roman mass followed, pressing deeper, tightening. Thousands of men compressed into a shrinking space, soldiers in the rear ranks pushing the front ranks forward, even as the front ranks had no room to swing their swords. Then the African veterans on the flanks pivoted inward, both sides at once, turning like doors on hinges, closing around the Roman mass from both sides. Then the Carthaginian cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen on both wings, came around to the rear. The Romans were surrounded. What happened next took approximately 6 hours. 70,000 men died in those 6 hours. Packed too tightly to run, too compressed to fight properly, they died where they stood. Ancient sources describe the ground afterward. Bodies layered on bodies, men suffocated rather than killed by the weight of the fallen pressing down on the wounded. Among the dead, one of the 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, 80 men of senatorial rank, 29 of Rome's 48 military tribunes, an entire generation, again. The other consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, the one who had pushed for this battle, who had promised Rome a quick end to its humiliation, survived. He rode off the field before the encirclement closed. When Varro returned to Rome, no one executed him. No one put him on trial. A delegation of Roman senators met him at the city gates and thanked him for not giving up on the Republic. That was Rome. Even at its worst moment, it refused to collapse inward. Cannae is still taught in every military academy in the world, not as ancient history, as doctrine. The double envelopment, the perfect encirclement, the battle that defined how armies tried to destroy each other for the next 2,000 years. After Cannae, Maharbal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, came to him. "Give me the cavalry," he said. "In 5 days you will dine on the capital." Hannibal said no. Maharbal looked at him for a long moment. Whether he actually said what came next, or whether it was embellished by later Roman writers who needed to explain the war's strange outcome, we cannot know. But Livy records it, and it has echoed down 2,000 years for a reason. "You know how to win a victory," he said. "You do not know how to use one." He had his reasons. Rome's walls were strong. He had no siege equipment. It had been left behind in Spain. He needed allies to open the gates, and while some Italian cities were now defecting to him, not enough had. Not yet. He was waiting for Carthage to send reinforcements. More men, more siege equipment, enough to finish what he had started. He sent word home. He was still waiting when the seasons turned. What was coming from Carthage was not reinforcements. The morning after Cannae, Hannibal walked the field. 70,000 bodies. The plain was so thick with them that his men spent the next 3 days collecting the rings of dead Roman knights and senators, gold rings pulled from the fingers of Rome's dead aristocracy. When they were done, they filled 3 bushels. He sent his brother Mago to Carthage with the rings and the news. Mago walked into the Carthaginian Senate chamber and stood before the full assembly, before Hanno, before every senator who had questioned this war, before every merchant who had called the Barca family reckless. And then he upended the bushels onto the floor of the Senate hall. Hundreds of gold rings rang out against the marble, rolling in every direction, piling up at the senator's feet. 3 bushels of Roman gold, each ring a dead Roman aristocrat, each ring a senator, a knight, a commander. He let the sound die. Then he spoke. He also sent a peace delegation to Rome. His cavalry commander Carthalo rode north under a flag of truce, carrying terms. Not conquest, not slavery, but negotiation. Recognition that Rome had lost. A settlement that would end the killing. The Roman Senate refused to receive him. They sent him back without an audience. And then they did something Hannibal had not expected. They kept recruiting. While burying their dead, Rome raised new legions. While grieving, Rome made peace talk politically unthinkable. Senators who had proposed abandoning the city were publicly shamed. A delegation came from Capua, Rome's most important ally. Roman sources record them issuing an ultimatum: give us a consul, or we go to Hannibal. Rome refused. Capua closed its gates and defected. Let them go, Rome said. Let every city that wants to leave, leave. And they made a list. Every name, every city, every betrayal, recorded, remembered, waiting. They were not broken. They had learned something at Cannae that Hamilcar had learned in Sicily 25 years earlier, that losing a battle was not the same as losing a war, that if you refused to accept the result could change. In Carthage, the Senate gathered. Hanno the Great stood up. Hanno had opposed this war from the beginning. He belonged to the faction of landowners and senators who had always seen the Barca family as a dangerous, independent power, men who built personal armies, personal loyalty, personal empires in Spain, men who made wars the Senate hadn't authorized for objectives the Senate hadn't approved. He said, "I told you so." He said, "Victory changes nothing. Rome will not negotiate from weakness. Rome has never negotiated from weakness, and sending more men and money to Hannibal in Italy will only prolong a war we do not control, in a theater we cannot afford, for goals we did not choose." The other faction, Hannibal's allies, the Barcid supporters, argued back. The man has just killed 70,000 Romans with 40,000 soldiers. Give him another 20,000. Give him siege equipment. Give him 1 season. He will end this. The debate went on, and Hannibal waited. Here is the part that history does not often tell. After Mago poured those rings onto the Senate floor, Carthage actually voted yes. They voted to send reinforcements, 12,000 infantry, 1,500 cavalry, 20 war elephants, everything Hannibal needed. The Barcid faction had won the argument. Then the news arrived from Spain. At the Battle of Dertosa in 215 BC, the Scipio brothers had destroyed a Carthaginian army. The silver mines in Spain, the mines that funded everything, the commercial foundation that Hamilcar had spent years building, were suddenly at risk. Carthage's merchant class made a calculation, not a military calculation, a commercial one. The reinforcements meant for Hannibal were rerouted to Spain. The 12,000 infantry went to defend the mines. The 1,500 cavalry went to stabilize the frontier. The decision that ended any real chance of winning in Italy was made not in rage or cowardice, but in the cold logic of asset protection. They did not abandon Hannibal. They chose the silver over the war. What he actually received, 4,000 Numidian cavalry and 40 war elephants dispatched to Locri in the south. Substantial, not what he needed. The 12,000 infantry that might have broken the stalemate went to Spain. The siege equipment that could have opened Rome's gates never left port. What he needed, 20,000 men and siege towers. One decisive push before Rome recovered from Cannae, before the panic faded, before the Italian allies who had just defected started wondering if they'd bet on the wrong side. The window after Cannae was real, not whether Rome could have been stormed. Its walls were strong, and without siege equipment no assault succeeds, but whether enough Italian cities, in that moment of Roman terror, would have opened their gates. Whether Capua plus 7 or 8 major allied cities might have strangled Rome's manpower base. Whether Rome's alliance system, the thing that made it impossible to kill, might finally have fractured. We will never know. What Carthage sent instead was a war in Spain. Rome had been fighting in Spain since 218 BC. The Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus, had opened that front the same year Hannibal crossed the Alps. For 6 years they held Hasdrubal to a standstill, bleeding his army, burning his supply lines, making sure he could not break north toward the Alps. Then in 211 BC, both brothers were killed in the same campaign season. Ambushed in separate engagements, their armies destroyed. For a moment, the Spanish front collapsed. Rome sent a replacement. Publius Cornelius Scipio, 25 years old, son and nephew of the men who had just died in Spain, the same young officer who had saved his father at the Ticinus River and survived Cannae. He had never held a major command. He had no legal right to a proconsular appointment at his age. The Senate gave it to him anyway, because there was no one else. He arrived in Spain in 210 BC. What happened next is a different story. For now, the point is this. The Scipio family, first the brothers, then the son, kept Hasdrubal pinned in Spain. Hasdrubal could not get his army to Italy. Hannibal, in southern Italy, spent those years winning skirmishes, holding what he had, watching his Italian allies wonder when the reinforcements were coming. They were never coming. In 207 BC, Hasdrubal finally broke through in Spain. He crossed the Alps, the same crossing his brother had made 11 years earlier, with a fresh army. He sent riders ahead to find Hannibal, to tell him, "I'm here, I'm coming. Meet me in northern Italy and together we will finish this." The riders never reached Hannibal. Roman forces intercepted Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River in central Italy before the two armies could link up. The battle was decisive. Hasdrubal's army was destroyed. Hasdrubal himself died fighting, refusing to surrender. Hannibal was camped in the south, still waiting. The first thing he knew of his brother's defeat came when a Roman soldier rode to the edge of his camp and threw something over the perimeter. Hasdrubal's severed head. Hannibal looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "I see there the fate of Carthage." He was 40 years old. He had been in Italy for 11 years. He had never been defeated in a major battle, and he had spent those 11 years watching his army slowly bleed out, not in defeat, but in attrition, in isolation, in the slow strangulation of a force that was never resupplied at scale, never reinforced enough to finish the war, never given what it needed to deliver the final blow. He kept fighting. What else was he going to do? But something had changed. The fire was still there. The skill was still there. The men who had crossed the Alps with him, the ones who were still alive, they would follow him anywhere. But the war had become something different now. It had become survival, and the question wasn't whether Hannibal would defeat Rome anymore. The question was whether Carthage would survive long enough for that to matter. 211 BC. Hannibal had been in Italy for 7 years. He had not lost a battle. He had killed more Roman soldiers than any enemy in the Republic's history. He had cracked the Italian alliance system. Capua and a dozen other cities had defected to him, and Rome was strangling them back, one by one. While Hannibal held the south, Roman forces had spent 2 years besieging Capua, the most important city that had defected, the city whose loss had shaken Rome more than any other. Capua's food was running out. Its people were dying. Hannibal marched north, not to attack Rome, he still had no siege equipment, but to force the Senate to lift the siege. He camped within 3 miles of Rome's walls. His cavalry rode to the gates. The phrase Romans had been using since Cannae, Hannibal at Portus, Hannibal at the gates, was now literally true. Rome did not move. The Senate stayed in session. The consuls kept their armies at Capua. No one panicked. The message was precise and deliberate. We will not leave Capua to meet you in open battle. We know what happens when we meet you in open battle. Hannibal turned back south. A few weeks later, Capua fell. Rome had understood something, slowly, expensively, at a cost of more than 100,000 dead. The understanding had existed years earlier. After Trasimene in 217 BC, Rome had appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the same Fabius whose shadow and starve strategy was already working before the Senate lost patience with it. When his own subordinate, Minucius, won a minor skirmish against Hannibal's foragers, the Senate celebrated and elevated Minucius to co-dictator alongside Fabius, handing Hannibal's enemy a second commander to exploit. Hannibal saw the opening immediately. He lured Minucius into a full battle and nearly destroyed him. Fabius had to ride in and save him. When Fabius's term ended in 216 BC, Rome elected Varro, the consul who had promised a quick end to the war, and built the largest army the Republic had ever fielded. Cannae followed. 70,000 men dead in an afternoon, and suddenly no one called Fabius a coward anymore. The strategy Rome had mocked and discarded in 217 BC became its only viable doctrine, not by choice, but because the alternative had just killed more Romans than any single battle in the Republic's history. Fabius had been right. It had cost Rome everything to admit it, but Fabius was only half the story. In the same years that Rome ground Hannibal down through attrition, refusing his battles, reclaiming his Italian allies city by city, starving his supply lines, a younger officer was working on a different problem. Not how to contain Hannibal, but how to end him. Publius Cornelius Scipio was 20 years old at Cannae. He had survived the battle, one of the few senior officers who had. According to Livy, in the chaos afterward he drew a sword and stood over the surviving tribunes who were talking about abandoning Rome and forced them to swear an oath. We stay. We fight. Polybius does not record the scene, but what happened next is beyond dispute. In the years that followed, he spent his time not fighting Hannibal, but learning from him. We don't know exactly how he did it, but by the time he reached Spain, something had changed in how Rome understood Hannibal's battles, the terrain choices, the cavalry deployment, the way the center was designed to invite pressure before the flanks closed in. He was building something, a counter, an answer to a question no one else had answered yet. The war had shifted. Hannibal still won every engagement he chose to fight, but Rome had found two things it had lacked at Cannae: a strategy that denied him the battles he needed, and a man who understood how to win the battle that would finally matter. Hannibal, in the south, was still waiting for Carthage. 203 BC. Hannibal received the order: come home. He had been in Italy for 15 years. He had won every major battle he had fought. He had never been driven from the field, and now Carthage, the same Carthage that had never sent him the scale of reinforcements he needed, was summoning him back because someone had finally taken the war to Africa. That someone was Scipio. Publius Cornelius Scipio had gone to Spain in 210 BC, 25 years old, no formal legal claim to a proconsular command, elected by the Roman assembly because no one else would take the job after his father and uncle were killed. In his first year, he took Cartagena, the Carthaginian headquarters, in a single day's assault. It would take 4 more years of campaigning until the decisive battle at Ilipa in 206 BC to finally shatter Carthaginian power in Spain. Then he had gone back to Rome and proposed the unthinkable: take the war to Africa, stop fighting Hannibal in Italy, attack Carthage directly. The Senate was skeptical. Fabius opposed it, but Rome was exhausted, and Scipio had a plan. He landed in North Africa in 204 BC with some 30,000 men. He won 2 engagements against Carthaginian forces in quick succession. By then, Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, the same breed that had torn apart Roman legions at Cannae, was riding for Rome. Carthage panicked. They recalled Hannibal. He came back to a country he barely recognized. When he had left in 218 BC, Carthage was the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. Now the city was intact, but the empire was gone. The silver mines in Spain, the commercial engine of the whole Barcid project, were in Roman hands. The Numidian alliance was broken, and somewhere in North Africa, a Roman general was waiting to finish what Cannae had started. Hannibal assembled what he could. Ancient estimates give him roughly 36,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, including his last war elephants, 80 of them, the largest elephant force he had ever commanded. They met at Zama in October of 202 BC. Scipio had spent 15 years learning from Hannibal's battles. Now he applied the lesson. Hannibal's 80 war elephants were the largest elephant force assembled in the western Mediterranean. They were meant to smash the Roman line before the infantry even engaged. Against most Roman generals, they would have. Scipio had prepared for them. He arranged his maniples with gaps between the units, open corridors running through the Roman line from front to back. When the elephants charged, the Roman soldiers stepped aside and let them through. The beasts thundered down the lanes, harmlessly, and out the rear. The Roman formation held. The cavalry was the second lesson. At Cannae, Hannibal's horsemen had routed the Roman cavalry on both flanks, then wheeled inward to seal the encirclement. Scipio's Numidian cavalry, Maximus's men, former Carthaginian allies now riding for Rome, drove Hannibal's horsemen off both wings. Then they wheeled inward. It was not Cannae repeated perfectly. Scipio had no time for the slow double encirclement, and the infantry contest played out differently. It was Cannae's ghost, cavalry deciding the battle from the rear, just as Hannibal had designed it. Hannibal watched it happen from the field. He had perfected this at Cannae. He had used it to kill tens of thousands of Romans in an afternoon, and he was watching it kill his men. He escaped. About half his army did not. The meeting had come the day before, while both men still hoped the battle might not be necessary. According to Livy, they spoke through interpreters in the open ground between the two armies. Hannibal had spoken first. He had told Scipio, "Look at what I was, and look at what I am now. Fortune turns. You are young and you are winning. Accept terms and go home. Do not trust luck to hold." Scipio had refused. Now the terms were dictated, not negotiated. Carthage would give up its navy, give up its war elephants, pay Rome 10,000 silver talents over 50 years, and get Roman permission before going to war with anyone. Carthage accepted. Hannibal, 45 years old, walked away from Zama alive, still undefeated in Italy. Defeated once, at the end, by a man who had spent his career learning to be him. The war was over. He came home to a city that did not know what to do with him. When the peace terms came, some Carthaginians had wanted to fight on. He had stood up in the Senate and argued for acceptance. The terms were brutal, but the alternative was worse. Rome's army was in Africa, and Carthage had nothing left to fight with. He had been right. The city stood. He was 45 years old. He had spent 25 years at war. He had never been defeated in Italy. He had lost one battle at the end under circumstances that would have broken most generals before the campaign even started. Carthage had survived. Rome had not marched on the city. The terms were harsh, but Carthage was still there. And Hannibal was still there, the most famous soldier alive, the man Rome had spent more than 20 years trying to kill, walking the streets of Carthage in peacetime. That made people uncomfortable. He ran for office. In 196 BC, he was elected suffect, the senior magistrate of Carthage, roughly equivalent to a consul. He had spent his life fighting. Now he turned the same systematic intelligence toward governance. What he found disgusted him. Carthage's finances were a disaster. The war had drained the treasury. The aristocratic families who dominated the government had spent decades using public funds as personal revenue. The taxation system was rigged. The courts were controlled by the 104, a council of hereditary judges who served for life, answered to no one, and had spent generations protecting the wealth of the families that produced them. He restructured everything. He forced the magistrates to face annual elections. He audited the treasury. He found enough revenue to begin paying Rome's war indemnity, 50 years of payments, without raising taxes on ordinary citizens. Within 2 years, Carthage was solvent. This was the wrong thing to do. The aristocratic families he had just stripped of their financial privileges still had friends in Rome. They sent word, Hannibal is building a military alliance with the Seleucid king, Antiochus. He is planning to renew the war. It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. Rome sent an embassy demanding that Carthage hand him over. The Senate, Hanno's faction, the merchant families, the men who had spent 20 years blocking his requests for reinforcements, voted to comply. 195 BC. He was 52 years old. He left that night. He had learned, from watching what Rome did to its enemies, that capture was not a fate worth waiting for. He packed what he could carry, slipped out of the city before dawn, and boarded a ship. He never came back, but the machine he had built kept running. 4 years after he fled, the Carthaginian Senate sent an embassy to Rome and offered to pay off the entire remaining war indemnity, 40 years of payments, in one lump sum. Right now, in silver. Rome refused. They insisted Carthage continue paying in annual installments. The reason was not generosity. The reason was fear. A Carthage that could produce that kind of cash, that quickly, after the most catastrophic military defeat in its history, was a Carthage that was coming back. The debt was not about money anymore. It was a leash. He had been gone for 4 years, and he had still beaten them at the treasury. He would spend the next 12 years searching for a king powerful enough and willing enough to shelter him somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean beyond Rome's reach. There was no such place. Tradition held that he had carried the poison for 12 years. Not as a last resort, as a plan. He had watched what Rome did to the men it caught, walked in chains through the streets, strangled in a dungeon afterward. He was not going to give them that. The ring never left his hand. From Carthage, he had gone east, to the court of Antiochus III, the Seleucid king whose empire stretched from the Aegean coast across much of the Near East and beyond, the most powerful monarch alive. The one man, with enough territory and enough soldiers to shelter a fugitive Rome, wanted dead. Hannibal advised him. He argued for a coordinated campaign. Antiochus pressing from the east, Hannibal landing in Greece or Africa, Rome caught between 2 wars at once. Antiochus listened, and then decided he knew better. In 190 BC, Rome destroyed Antiochus at the Battle of Magnesia. 70,000 Seleucid soldiers against 30,000 Romans, and it wasn't close. The peace terms made him impossible to shelter. Hannibal was already gone. He spent time in Crete. Then he went to Bithynia, a small kingdom on the southern shore of the Black Sea, ruled by a king named Prusias I, who needed a military mind against his enemy Eumenes of Pergamon. Hannibal served him. He was in his late 50s, commanding a fleet he had never trained for, fighting at sea instead of on land. He found a way to win anyway. Before one naval engagement against Eumenes' fleet, he had his sailors fill clay pots with venomous snakes and ordered them thrown onto the enemy ships when the fleets closed. The enemy sailors opened the pots. The decks erupted into chaos. Hannibal's men boarded while they were occupied with the snakes. This story comes from Cornelius Nepos, the only ancient source that records it. Polybius and Livy are silent. Whether it happened exactly this way, we cannot know. In Nepos's account, the trick worked. But Prusias was not a protector. He was a calculation. When Roman envoys arrived in 183 BC and asked that Prusias hand over the fugitive he was harboring, Prusias did not hesitate. He agreed before the envoys had finished asking. Hannibal had built his house at Libissa with multiple exits. He was the kind of man who always counted the exits. He had surveyed every route out, on foot, on horseback, toward the coast. That morning, Roman soldiers were waiting at everyone. He was 64 years old. He sat down. He had crossed the Alps. He had governed a city's finances back from the edge of ruin. He had won naval battles with clay pots full of snakes. He had carried the poison for 12 years through every court and every kingdom, and had never once reached for it in weakness or despair. He reached for it now, not in despair, in contempt. Cornelius Nepos recorded what happened at the house. Livy preserved what he said. Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it irksome to wait for an old man's death. 183 BC. The man Rome had spent 36 years trying to capture had just done it for them. They never got to walk him through the streets in chains. 183 BC, or so the tradition holds for both. The year Hannibal died in Bithynia, Scipio died in Italy. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the man who had spent his career learning to think like Hannibal and used his methods against him at Zama, the most celebrated Roman of his generation, the general the Senate had honored with the name Africanus, Scipio of Africa, in recognition of a victory that had ended 17 years of war. Rome had not stayed grateful. In the years after Zama, his political enemies had been working. Chief among them was Marcus Porcius Cato, a man who believed that concentrated fame and military prestige were dangerous to the Republic, and who was willing to spend years building a legal case to prove it. The material they used came from the war against Antiochus. In 190 BC, Scipio had served as his brother Lucius's senior advisor at Magnesia, the battle that destroyed Antiochus's army and ended the Seleucid threat. The victory was total. The terms extracted a fortune in war indemnity, and Cato's faction moved to audit every coin of it. There were embezzlement charges, allegations of misappropriation of funds seized from the enemy, claims that Scipio's management of public resources was too personal, too unaccountable. Cato understood something that Scipio did not. A man who had defeated Hannibal and then Antiochus in the same decade was no longer just a general. He was a precedent. Scipio had won every battle he ever fought. He could not win this one. At his trial, by some accounts, he walked out mid-proceeding and reminded the crowd what day it was, the anniversary of his victory at Zama. He invited them to the temples to give thanks instead. Some sources say the crowd followed him, leaving the trial behind. The charges did not go away. He withdrew from Rome, retired to his estate at Liternum, a small coastal town north of Naples. He never returned. According to Livy, who records it as what tradition held, not as what he witnessed, the instruction Scipio left was this: Ingrata patria, ne ossa quidem mea habes. Ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones. He was buried at Liternum, not in Rome. 183 BC. 2 men dead. One had tried to destroy Rome. One had saved it. Both died the same year. Both died away from the cities that had used them. History remembered them both. Neither got the ending they deserved. There is a word military strategists still use today: Cannae. Not as a place name, as a concept. The double envelopment: fix the enemy's center, envelop both flanks, close the trap, destroy completely. It is still the template for decisive encirclement battles, still taught in military academies, still studied by generals who will never set foot on the field where it happened. Napoleon studied him. Erwin Rommel studied him. Alfred von Schlieffen built the German plan for the First World War explicitly around the Cannae model. Encircle France, destroy quickly, turn east before Russia mobilizes. The plan failed. The concept didn't. West Point teaches Cannae. So does Sandhurst, more than 2,200 years after the battle. Napoleon placed Hannibal among the greatest commanders in history, alongside Alexander, Caesar, and a handful of others. He studied the campaigns in detail. He also criticized him for not marching on Rome over Cannae, for failing to consolidate victories that could not be converted without siege equipment, for brilliant tactics in service of a strategy his own government would not support. That critique tells you something. Napoleon did not study Hannibal because he thought he was perfect. He studied him because even the failures were instructive. There is a question no historian has been able to answer. What if Carthage had supported him? Not a total commitment, just the cavalry and the siege equipment and the consistent resupply he asked for, over and over for 15 years. What if, in 215 BC or 212 BC or any of the years between, the merchant families of Carthage had decided that winning the war in Italy was worth more than protecting their investments in Spain? Would Rome have fallen? We don't know. But we know what he built without that support. The legions Rome used to conquer the world were shaped, partly, by the decades they spent learning to fight him. Rome came out of the Hannibalic War with things it had not possessed before. Longer campaigns, extended commands, soldiers who spent years under the same commander instead of a single season before being sent home, and a new legal reality, the prolongation of military command beyond the annual term, so a general could finish what he had started. It was Scipio's war that broke the old rule. 25 years old when he took Spain, his command renewed year after year until the job was finally done at Zama. That precedent would echo for 200 years, helping open the path that Caesar would one day walk, across the Rubicon and into the collapse of the same republic that had built the institution to survive Hannibal. He made Rome stronger by trying to destroy it, and in doing so, he set in motion the forces that would eventually destroy the republic anyway. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. The phrase survived him by centuries. It outlasted Carthage itself, which Rome destroyed in 146 BC, 37 years after his death. The survivors were sold into slavery. The city was erased from the map. The name outlasted all of it. For the rest of their history, Romans would invoke him when they needed words for their darkest fears. When the borders were pressed, when plague swept the cities, when the republic cracked and civil war began, someone always reached for the same comparison. Hannibal ad portas. He never made it through the gates, but he lived there, in Roman memory, forever.